Hi friends, welcome back to Heart. If you are new here, I'm your host, Cierra Dae. This is a podcast with a focus on how to come into more kindness, compassion, and acceptance for the self, our children, and our people. We learn tools of emotional intelligence, mindfulness, spirituality, and expression to deepen our relationships and heal wounds from generations of disconnect. I am coming in today, with a new setup, so the audio is TBD, to be determined if I enjoy it, if I like this setup. I'm trying something new with my camera because I've decided to post all of my episodes up on YouTube, so I'm recording with my Nikon, with my big girl camera, in order to have a better quality picture. But that may decrease the audio quality, so we're going to see how it works and see if we like it. And here we go. So today's episode is on connection. What is connection? This is another foundational podcast episode that I wanted to talk about in collaboration. This will probably be the last foundational episode that I will probably refer back to in following episodes. So the foundational ones are emotional intelligence. What is emotional intelligence? What is mindfulness? And now, what is connection? Because I think all of these things tie into one another, but they are needed to support one another and will support future podcast episodes as well and future conversations. I wanted to do this podcast episode because I talk a lot in my everyday life and on this podcast about connection. Like we need more connection. We need to connect more. And I realize that not everybody is fully in tune with what I mean by connecting, and it's because it's just it's a very broad, it's a broad statement, it's a broad word, and it can mean a lot of different things. So I wanted to go through what my definition of connecting and connection is, and then run through some different types of connection and how to do some of those things. So I'm specifically talking about human and social connection in this podcast episode. There's a few other types of connecting that I thought I wanted to touch into. One of them being like our connection to nature and our connection to spirit or the universe or God, because those are, they all tie in with one another, but they are all different types of connecting. But for this episode and for this intention and the purpose of this podcast episode, I'm going to keep it in the realm of human and social connecting. Also, my cat may come over here and be meowing at me every time she hears me. Oh, I think she hears me talking about her. Every time she hears me talking, she thinks I'm talking to her, which makes sense because I'm usually talking to her, but she hasn't really caught on yet that I'm talking to a camera, so she might come over here and talk to you guys and meow at me and therefore meow at you guys. I'm just gonna let her do her thing, accepting that I have a little feline child. So how I personally would define connecting or connection is the tie of communicating unity, understanding, presence, and compassion. There's a lot of, like, when we think about connection, when we think about connecting, there seems to be, like, in my mind, I visualize a merging of something, a coming together, a unionizing, a link, a relationship, a bond. And when I looked up multiple definitions for this, one of the ones that stood out to me was joining or being joined to something else. So you are feeling like you are a part of something. You are feeling unified with another person, with other people, and you aren't feeling alone in your experience, in the physical, in the emotional, in the spiritual. So in the realm of relationships, this applies, but this also applies to any type of connection or connecting. You need some love for a second? Okay, come here. You can connect with your animals. Animals was another one I wanted to touch on, but again, going to keep it to just human relationships. That would be pretty cool I would love to have someone who works with animals to come on and talk more about that. Because I think learning how to open our heart, coming back to heart, it truly isn't exclusive to just humans, and it shouldn't just be exclusive to just humans. Expanding our hearts, we are opening the understanding that we are connected to more than just ourselves. We are connected to more than just our family. We are connected to the planet. We are connected to our pets. We are connected to the birds and the trees. So there's plenty of other ties that we can get into in the future. So let us talk about the types of connection within the human and social connection. So there's a few different types of connections. I did a little bit of research before I jumped in here. I'm referencing an article from World Council for Health organization. So I will link this article in the description if you want to check it out. It's pretty brief, but it does give like good bullet points for the different types of connections. So I'll run through the 5 different types of connection, and then we'll talk about each one. So the first type of human and social connection is cognitive. The second type is physical. The third is biological. Fourth, emotional. And fifth, spiritual. So this article had lumped emotional and spiritual under the same type of connection, but I separated them here to talk about each one because while they are tied together, I deeply believe they're tied together. I believe all of these are tied together. So while they are tied together, there is different things that we can talk about underneath all of these. So, number 1, let's talk about the cognitive connection. This one I feel like is one of the easiest to do in our culture, like Western culture. Cognitive connection is like the exchanging of thoughts and ideas through interaction and communication. So it's just like this, like what I'm doing with you guys here. This is cognitive connection. I'm talking to you, you're listening to me through your podcast, or you're watching me on YouTube, and I'm explaining to you some of my beliefs. I'm explaining to you a lot of my thoughts and what's going on in my mind and in my brain. And this is easiest for us because it doesn't require too much vulnerability in more of the emotional realm or the physical realm. So this is a safe place for us to connect. So I feel like this is probably the biggest type of connection in, again, the Western culture, but I feel like in general, globally as well, this is the easiest one for us to experience. So moving forward throughout the rest of these different types of connection, I think that this one will be the easiest one for people to do and won't feel like you need so much work on or healing around, because our mind can often keep us in an analytical space in order to protect us from more of the touchy vulnerability things like emotions and physical intimacy. Cognitive connection doesn't really require a lot of intimacy. I don't have to disclose anything about myself that feels too intimate or too touchy or tender. And so this keeps a level of protection that we have for ourselves in order to not get too close to other people. With that, it's still a very, very, very important type of connection. Like, cognitive connection is still really important. Like, I love cognitive connection. Obviously, I wouldn't have a podcast. I love talking to people. I love sharing my thoughts. I love hearing other people's thoughts. I love long conversations about... I typically lean in more of like the emotional connection, where like, you know, this podcast is about vulnerable stuff and my YouTube channel is about very vulnerable stuff. So I don't really share a lot surface level, but I do when I go to coffee shops. I don't tell them about my whole life story and overshare. So I have these cognitive connections with people. and I'm able to just freely express. And it's still important if I feel a sense of social closeness, even though there's not a very intimate tie in that type of connection, because I still need that feeling of just like connecting with other adults, especially like working with kids so much. Their cognition is not very high most of the time, and their comprehension is not very high most of the time. You know, you're working, well, I specifically work between the ages of like 0 to 4. So they're learning, and I'm usually the one that's teaching them all of these cognitive skills and how to use language, and how to communicate. And so then I often feel like when I was nannying full time, I would feel very disconnected from society, because I would be constantly surrounded by people who couldn't really understand what I was saying, and I couldn't talk a lot about anything of substance outside of the ABCs or why we don't bite people's fingers, you know? So it is very important to still have that type of connection, even though it can be very surface level if you're wanting a deeper type of more vulnerable connection. This can also be a type of intellectual connection as well. Like if you have colleagues that you work with, you're able to share in your field of work and feel met and connected to, because they can understand, and they can, you feel a sense of unity with another person in a different way that you may not feel with like your spouse, because your spouse may not be in the same line of work. You can still get that sense of connection and fulfillment from intellectual cognitive connection. So the second type of connection is physical connection. And I feel like this is probably the one that people think about when they think about connection or connecting. And I feel like this is because of our culture around sex. I think that physical connection, I personally believe we don't have enough in our culture of platonic physical connection, but we need it. Like we so need it in a different degree than we're experiencing now. I know so many people, so many people, and it like pains my heart, that do not get hugs on a daily basis and are not feeling that physical closeness, especially if they're single and don't have a partner or a spouse. They're feeling like they are missing something because they can't physically connect with another person. And I don't mean that in a sexual sense. I'm saying we're not getting enough hugs. We're not getting enough, nice little pats on the shoulders. We're not getting enough tender, empathetic, compassionate touches that obviously aren't passing people's boundaries. But even today, like I was reflecting on an experience that I had. I was speaking with a mother. I had a Galentine's brunch with a nonprofit that I work with, and they were hosting a brunch for all of their volunteers and all of the people that worked with them over the past year. And I was speaking with a mother who was sharing with me, like very vulnerably, about the loss of her son. And like when she was sharing it with me, like it was hitting me so deeply. Like I could feel the pain that she was feeling. It was still very tender for her. So she was having a lot of emotions that were coming up. And so instinctually, my instinct was to place my hand on her shoulder and to like just rub her shoulder. And at first I had some feeling coming up in me of like, oh, maybe she doesn't want to be touched. And maybe she didn't. Maybe there was a feeling of like cringing, of withdrawal to that touch, to that empathetic touch. But I think that's where we have a challenge and a problem in our society of someone who is very purely wanting to just offer support in a compassionate way, but because it is so taboo for us, or it is so, maybe it feels dangerous or unsafe to receive that type of truly safe and healthy type of support, we feel resistant at the individual level, the person who wants to give the support, And we also feel resistance as a receiver of that support. And I don't know, I don't think that she was feeling resistance to that type of support. I didn't feel or sense anything from her that she wasn't wanting that type of touch. But it was an idea and a thought that came into my head of wanting to be able to respect people's boundaries and be cognizant of that. Like, know that I am, like, know what my actions, how my actions are affecting people at the emotional level. But these types of very small actions are very, like physical touch is very important for our well-being, our mental and our emotional well-being. It contributes to that. I think there's also, in our culture, you know, there's the culture of older men like placing a hand at the crook of a woman's back to like move past her. That is a totally different kind of touch that has intentions, underlying intentions that are not pure. So physical connection that is pure, that is platonic, that is truly coming from a place of honor and an integrity are the types of physical connections, platonic physical connections that I am speaking to. We receive these types of physical connections even in the way that we greet people. So across cultures, throughout cultures, we all have different ways of connecting with people at a physical level initially, like when we meet. That's why we have handshakes. In more endearing and touchy-feely cultures, you will have somebody that will come up and kiss your cheeks, or give you a hug, or pull you in for a side pat. So we have this instinct as humans to connect as soon as we meet a person. And we, as a culture, are the ones that decide what is okay and what is appropriate. For example, I was talking to another friend, this was a couple months back, and she's from, I believe it was Brazil initially. And we were talking about the cultural difference of greeting people, because when I went in to see her, I went in for a hug, and we were hugging, and her first instinct, which like she went to go kiss me on the cheek, and she realized, she was like, oh, like in my culture, that's normal. Like everyone kisses each other on the cheeks. But here, if I do that, it is very uncomfortable for people, and people get really weird about it. But it's very, very normal for her. And so we're the ones that put that connotation on touch. And also of like from our experiences, and again, the intention behind touch and contact. With all of this, physical contact is very, very important for connection. And this isn't just like with new people that you meet, like also with your spouse, with your friends, with your children. It's very important for us to have physical touch in a multitude of different ways in order to continue building that bonding, that trust, and that tie of unity. So when we are playing with our children, the tickles, the massages, the throwing them up in the air, the rolling on the ground with them, it's very important for them and for us to feel unified and to feel connected with and connected to. This is why I love like working in the family home, because I'm able to build a relationship with the family where they trust me and their children trust me, and then we can have that physical contact where we are rolling on the ground, we do airplane, we have our tickles, we have our fun. And I notice that this is a big taboo in the public school system, obviously, because it's a very touchy subject, but it's even gotten to the point, I remember in middle school, where like, you know, middle school's different. There's hormones, everything's kind of raging at that point. But I wasn't allowed to hug friends. Like, we had a no hugging policy. You were not allowed to hug anybody at school. And I remember I got lunch detention. I was a goody two shoes in, I was going to say high school, but high school I rebelled a little bit. In middle school and elementary school, I was a goody two shoes. And so when I got lunch detention, I was petrified. I was so upset with myself. I felt shame for wanting to hug this other person, for doing something wrong. And so then there was this new culture around hugging for me, that hugging was wrong. And so it was really hard for me to go through as a student, as an individual, But it's also really hard for me to see and to witness as now an adult coming out of that system, coming out of the public school system. It's really hard to witness, and I don't want to be a contributor in that. So it is very important for us to create a new culture around physical touch that is not just sexual, that does not have any unpure intentions behind it. We need to create a renewed sense of purity around physical touch in a way that is respectful and honoring and loving and endearing, and is not just about sexual intention or sexual desire. With that, obviously with your spouses or your partners, sexual touch and connection is still very important. Like, it is very important for you to have that type of unifying connection with your partner or with your spouse. Not everybody has that desire. There are people who are asexual, so that is just a form of physical connection that can help to increase the bonding, increase the trust, increase the unification or the feeling of unification, but it is not 100% necessary in order to feel close to another person and to feel connected to. But everyone has their own different levels of desire and need for physical contact in general. Okay, let's move on to number 3. So the third type of connection is biological. Biological meaning your connection to your family, the family that is your blood. So this is your mom and dad that you were born to or born from, and also your ancestors, so the previous generations that came before you. This is a feeling of connection and safety with our family. This one can have a lot of, just like with the physical, where there can be a lot of trauma and healing that needs to be addressed. Biological can be one of these too, because family and the biological connection is not always the safest feeling or a feeling of unity. So we store we store our DNA and our genes that come from this family tree, that come from our parents and their parents and their parents' parents and their parents' parents, and so on and so forth. So we have learned through science that we are being passed down, essentially, all of these experiences in our DNA. So the emotional experiences of our family members is passed down through us, through our DNA. So we have a lot of programming, if you want to call it that. We have a lot of programming within our systems of how we respond to life, but also how we respond to connection, how we respond to family. Ideally, if we have an ideal family situation, we have a family unit that helps us to feel secure and safe and seen by. The ideal outcome of connection is to feel fully seen and fully loved. So the biological family and the biological family unit is ideally to be able to offer this support. This is why it's very important, why I talk a lot about parents connecting with their children so that their children feel seen, is so that we are breaking a lot of the ties that unfortunately have been repeated, a lot of the patterns that have been repeated over generations of being lost in the inner world, or being lost to addiction, being lost to the unconscious state of being, where we aren't being intentional, where we don't know how to step into presence and be mindful about how we are connecting with our children. So when our children feel fully seen and feel fully loved, it gives them opportunity to thrive and to feel safe enough to take action and make choices in their life that help them to move forward and onward and upward, instead of having to be in a state of survival. And so it's also important for us to do this for ourselves at an individual level, to heal from whatever we didn't receive to feel fully loved and fully seen, in order to give ourselves that feeling of safety that we didn't receive from the family unit. I'm going to do a future episode, probably the next episode, on the inner child, what is the inner child, and how to work with them, because that is a key into how to give ourselves that feeling of safety and security in order to receive all of these things that we need at a biological and emotional level too. So that brings me to the fourth form of connection, which is emotionally connecting, or emotional connection. So this is the foundation of understanding and trust between two people to be seen and responded to. This is pretty much the definition or the premise of empathy. Empathy is being able to witness another person and their emotions, see, like, label, categorize, describe what that emotion is, and then understand it at some level. This doesn't mean that we're always going to understand the person's experience. I'm a white woman, so like I do not understand what a black woman is going through, what a black man is going through. Like I would not be able to understand at all what their experience is like, but I can empathize with whatever feelings may come from some of the hardships that they experience. So, grief or frustration or anger or sadness, like those are feelings that I have felt, not from the specific things that they experience, but I have experienced those feelings and I know how those things can feel. And so I'm able to empathize with it, to feel it, and to understand it. So we have to do this with everybody. We have to do this with ourselves. We have to do this with our children. We have to do this with our friends. We have to do this with strangers in order to build and expand and come back to our hearts. This is like what I said in the latter part of this definition of being seen and responded to. So being witnessed in that emotion and also responding with a feeling of compassion and understanding, and not being passive or checking out. When I think about emotional connecting, I think a lot about the beginnings of this process for humans, which is in our infancy when we are born. And I think about it a lot because I've been a nanny for going on a decade now, which is crazy to me to say out loud. Like every year I have to add another year to it, and now I've come to a decade, and I'm like, it's just such a long time to be in any type of career, any type of dedicated work. But in working with children now for 10 years, I've worked with so many families, so many babies. And in the beginning of becoming a nanny, I was just in my patterns. I was just in what I knew to be true from my experience, not so much as what I know to be best. And so I feel a lot of sadness for how I responded and how I advocated for families to respond to infants when they are asking for their needs to be met and for their emotional needs to be met. And I think about specifically, and this is the most challenging with parents, and there may be some conflicting feelings on this, but the crying it out method in working with babies, it used to be something that I was an advocate for, of, putting a baby in their crib when you are trying to get them to be more self-sufficient or independent and being able to sleep through the night. You'll leave them in their crib or in their room and let them cry until they stop. And saying it out loud, like, I have like all of this like cringing feeling, like I was imagining a baby in my head crying, and like my body is like pulling me towards the baby, because I've worked through a lot of, honestly, it's the conditioning of our response to raising babies and children. And so, like, not going too deep into that, maybe another episode, I would really love to bring someone on who is a professional in that line of work. But the beginnings of our emotional experience, our needs being met, is so important in how we now are then seeking out and allowing our needs to be met or not met in our romantic relationships or with our children. And so then we may be repeating those patterns that we had learned, what at one point thought were right, to our children. With the crying it out method, we are not responding to the needs of our children, of our babies. And babies are defenseless. Babies can't do anything for themselves. And so their need is you, is a parent, is an adult, is somebody who can care for them and make sure that they are provided for. And so then when they're crying, and if we're doing the cry it out method, and they're not being tended to, and somebody's not coming to check on them, to take care of them, the brain of the baby assumes that they are alone, that they are not going to be taken care of, and so then they go into their own survival space. And so then this creates a snowball effect of honestly emotional neglect in our emotional body and our physical body. And so then it manifests in a bunch of different ways in our relationships and in our dynamics and in our patterning. So how to do these things differently, that's what these podcasts are for, is to help us unlearn and relearn and understand and dive into curiosity, because it's very important for us to stay in that place of curiosity. And what I do now is probably going to change in the next 10 years, because there's going to be new research that comes out, there's going to be new understanding. I'm going to go through my own healing, and hopefully I'll have my own children in the next 10 years. And so then there's going to be more layers of things that I probably don't even have in my field of perspective or vision, because I am not going through the maiden to mother experience yet. So I haven't had that. While I have all of this experience with children, there's a special type of experience that comes when you have your own children and you are responsible for that child 24/7. So there's going to be a lot of stuff that comes up, I know. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with there being in a place of imperfection. And so I want to speak to you as the listener or the viewer of this, that it's okay for you to not be doing things perfectly right now. And you even feeling that, like if you feel a sense of guilt, it means that you care. It means that there's something within you that cares. And guilt can be a healthy emotion for us to take action moving forward. So use this as a tool in order for you to help to understand and learn and grow, and know that we are not perfect beings and we are learning every single day. And I believe that we are put here to do this work. Okay, so the last type of connection, like I said earlier, they put emotional and spiritual connection together, but I separated the emotional and the spiritual. So spiritual connection is the last type of connection. And spiritual connection, not everybody has a belief system. I was agnostic, and then I was atheist, and then I was agnostic again. And now I don't have a specific type of religion that I would say that I follow, because I think that there is wisdom and truth in so many different types of beliefs and religions. But I follow a lot of Christianity, Buddhism, Taoism. So I have like a variety of experience. One of my friends, actually Ambrosia Owens, she was a guest on the podcast. She was in episode 3, this past episode. She told me recently, she was being so sweet, and she shared with me an admiration that she had of me. She told me that I had a deep understanding of duality and non-duality. And I took it as a really deep compliment, because I think being able to move through those two different dualities, duality and non-duality, is really important, because you don't have a narrow perspective. So I'm grateful that I had the experience of being agnostic and atheist, because honestly, I know how isolating it felt at that time. Like for me, the experience of atheism, it was a protective measure. There was honestly an anger towards God because of my experience. I am queer, and so I grew up Christian, and so then there was this belief system that I was not loved and accepted and valued as a person because of this trait about myself. And so then I had this underlying anger, this unconscious anger towards God and the universe. And so I turned to atheism as a protective measure against those feelings. And now I've just recently come into being more open to Christianity. It honestly took me a while. Buddhism helped to open me up to that. Mindfulness helped open me up to that. Taoism helped open me up to that. And plant medicine helped open me up to that. So I realized how connected everything is, how connected all of these religions are ultimately to each other, and how the underlying love is there in all of them if you know where to look and if you know how to listen to the word of God, the feeling of the universe or nature or the planet. There's an intelligence, there's a life force that is there for us to touch. And so with this, spiritual connection is us being able to connect with people and communicate within the same realm of our belief and value systems. This spiritual connection is not always within the realm of religion. I think that you can have a deep spiritual connection with someone if you have a deep value system that is very similar with another person. So this helps us to feel connected at a soul level, at a level that goes beyond just the emotional or the physical. You feel connected to another person, and a lot of people can describe this as soulmates. Twin flames is a big terminology right now, which I have thoughts about. I actually had a podcast episode with my ex. At the time we weren't dating, but I have a podcast episode about different types of soul relationships. I'll also link that in the description if you're interested in that, because that kind of goes a little bit deeper in some of my spiritual beliefs. So I will link that there. So these are our 5 different types of connection: our cognitive, physical, biological, emotional, and spiritual. All of these, with the exception of cognitive connection, really come with a deep vulnerability. It is not always easy, and it is not always simple and comfortable to open yourself up to these types of connecting, but it's very important for us to do the work to expand our capacity for these types of connections in self-respecting ways. Like, don't overdo it in a way that's going to overwhelm your system. I recommend, if you're wanting to get into expanding your system, working with practitioners or therapists who can gently walk you through these processes so that you aren't re-traumatizing yourself, essentially, if you have physical abuse, emotional abuse, verbal abuse in the past within relationships. It can be really important for those people who are understanding and able to walk you through in a way that is conscious of those experiences and the effects that it has on your system. So connection is not passive at all. It's an active effort. It requires energy and action with everybody that you're wanting to have a deep connection to. With children, it takes time and it takes presence. I really highly recommend, if this is the first podcast episode that you're listening to and you haven't listened to my other episodes, highly recommend listening to at least podcast episode number 2 with mindfulness, because it kind of walks you through what is presence and how to drop into that with your children. And this is very, very important for connection, of learning these mindfulness tools in order to come out of fully identifying with the mind so that you can connect deeper, because otherwise we're working actively to try to connect, but we don't know how. We don't know how to be able to present, and we're just forcing eye contact because they're like, okay, Cierra said that eye contact and physical touch is important in order to connect. And so you look at your child, you're trying to force your child, you're pulling its chin and trying to get some eye contact, and then you're holding its shoulders or something. That is not how we encourage connection. and presence. So listen to podcast episode 2. There's other resources on mindfulness. Google is your best friend. Use it. And there's other podcasts, I'm sure, on different ways of how to drop into presence. So dropping into presence is, that is energy, that's action, that's active effort. Active effort means that you're doing something intentionally to make some kind of change or make some kind of impact. One of the things that I did really want to touch on, because this is huge with families, huge with children, and I'm not saying this from any type of judgment or shame, but it is an important note that is becoming like increasingly more of a problem with connection is, and I'm also speaking from my own experience and my own challenges, is screen time. Tablets, specifically for children. It inhibits connection. Screens inhibit connection. Tablets inhibit connection. TVs inhibit connection. It's a defense mechanism. It's a coping mechanism for whatever we're feeling internally, whatever emotions that we're feeling internally that we may not be yet ready to face, but do need to face and look at and need to give some time and some space and some energy towards. This is the same thing with children. So I really highly recommend being aware, conscious, intentional of how much screen time your child is having and placing boundaries on it, and maybe making some space for connection time before dinner, after dinner. I recommend after dinner, like not having any screens before like an hour or 2, 3 hours before bed. So that way you guys have a chance to connect, the children have time to unwind, and you're able to really drop into presence and connection with them and end the day on a positive note. So I believe that there's different levels to connection, and, connecting with children is going to look different from connecting with an adult. Connecting with children, you'll have a lot more play involved, but you can also have play, and you should have play within your adult relationships too, in order to foster more connection. So there were the 5 different types of connection, but then there's 4 different ways of connection that are all very important. One is physical touch. We talked about the physical connection. The other is eye contact, so making eye contact with your people, with your children. The third is playfulness, so being able to have a silly and enjoyable experience with your person or with your people. And the last one is presence. So again, going back into the mindfulness. So in order to use all of these different types of connecting, there are so many tools for each of these. For all of these, for physical touch, you can do, there's something in conscious discipline called love rituals, where you have a song and physical touch game that goes with each song. When I was younger, and I do this with all of the kids that I nanny, my mom always had this game of, I call it Little Mousy, but she would take her little fingers and pretend they were little mice, and she would put them on my feet, and she would say, "Here comes a little mousy." And as she says that, the little mousy is climbing up my legs, and she says, "From the barnyard to the housey." And when they come to the housey, she would tickle underneath my chin and under my armpits and up on my chest. So this was a really beautiful game that my mom taught all of us children, and I have done with every single one of the kids that I work with. It's playful, it's funny, the kids like it because they like the little mouse crawling up their body and then coming to tickle them. But this is a type of love ritual, and that encourages connection with our children. Tantra is a type of physical connection that you can practice with your partner. Tantra isn't just sexual. Again, not going to go too deeply into that, but you can do more research on what Tantra is and how to do it with a partner. But it involves all of these things of presence, eye contact, playfulness, and physical touch. A tool for the cognitive connection is active listening. So if somebody is sharing with you, like you are probably maybe practicing active listening right now, you don't have to be too engaged because I'm just talking to you. Like you're not having to really receive me because you're not in front of me. But if you were a friend that was sitting in front of me, then you would be making eye contact. Like, I'm making eye contact with this camera. When I when I was started learning how to talk to a camera, I was like, okay, pretend that this camera is the eyeball of a person that you're talking to. And it helped a lot, because active listening, I constantly am making eye contact. I'm like nodding my head that I'm listening. There's like cues that we are making to show the speaker that they are being heard and understood, and then you can reciprocate in conversation after they finish whatever thought process they're having, and then you can respond in whatever way. Active questions are really important too, like asking questions. That was like one of the key things that I learned. For some reason, I didn't learn it, like in my teen years. I didn't really learn. I was honestly a very crappy listener. I was a crappy communicator. When I was younger, like listening is a skill, communication is a skill, and so like you can learn how to improve it. And one of the things that you can do to improve communication and conversations is asking questions. And that seems like a no-brainer now, where I'm like, yeah, duh, of course. Like, how else would you have conversation? But I didn't really have that experience growing up of like people asking me inquisitive questions to go deeper into the conversation. It was more just kind of like outpouring of information from both parties. They weren't very interactive conversations. So asking questions is very important. When you're learning how to improve these skills, most of the time it feels like you're faking something. And that's just the reality of learning a new skill or improving upon a skill, is that we are not great at it. And so you're gonna feel like it's not, like you're not doing it right. But keep doing it, keep showing up, and keep asking questions. All right, guys, that is all that I have for you today on connection. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast episode. I'm so grateful that you're here. I'm so grateful that you're doing all of the work that you're doing. Know that it is recognized, and even if you don't feel like you're doing anything, just listening and learning is not just listening and learning. Like, it is impacting so much of your life in small ways, but small is not inconsequential. Like, you are making an impact in your life and in the life of your family and in the life of your people. If you like this episode, please like, subscribe, leave a review or a testimonial. I would absolutely, really deeply love if you left some kind of love and let other people know how you felt about the podcast or this podcast episode, and help this reach more people and more families. If you want to get into contact with me, I will leave all of my information in the description so that you can get in contact with me. Please reach out if you have any questions, or if you have any ideas for future podcast episodes. I would love to hear it. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. Thank you for coming back to heart.